It was just a photograph. In the grand tapestry of a school year, it should have been a disposable memory, a flash of light in a crowded gymnasium, the smell of floor wax and popcorn, and the high-pitched chaos of a school event. There were smiling faces everywhere, children with painted cheeks and eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of being young. But if you drift your gaze to the back row, away from the center of the frame, the atmosphere of the image shifts. There, barely visible beneath the soft, overhead lighting, was Jack Sullivan. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at the camera. He looked like a boy trying to disappear into the drywall behind him. Zoom in. Look closer. Technology allows us to sharpen the pixels now, to pull clarity from the grain. There, just beneath his right eye, sits a faint, unmistakable shadow. At first, you want to tell yourself it is just the lighting. You want to believe it is a smudge of dirt from the playground or a remnant of face paint from the festivities. But it isn't. It is a bruise. A black eye, ripening in the middle of a crowd. At the time, no one said a word. Not the teachers who checked his homework. Not the staff at the daycare who saw him every afternoon. Not even his mother, Malia. Weeks before Jack and his sister Lily vanished into the thin air of a May morning, that photo was just a file on a hard drive. It would have meant nothing. An ordinary childhood mishap. A tumble on the stairs. A collision during a game of tag. But in a town like Waterton, a town now choking on its own silence, a town where two children vanished without a trace, this one image has become a match dropped on a pile of dry leaves. Because bruises, unlike people, don't lie. They are the body's way of keeping a receipt of what it has endured. Sometimes they outlive the very people who tried so desperately to cover them up. This is where the polished veneer of the Sullivan-Martel household began to unravel. The collapse didn't start with a frantic 911 call or a dramatic police report filed in the heat of the moment. It didn't start with a tearful confession in an interrogation room under the hum of fluorescent lights. It started with a bruise, a purple and yellow mark on a 4-year-old boy who could no longer speak for himself. In the heavy, humid days after that photo resurfaced and began circulating on social media and news feeds, questions began to leak from the cracks in the community's wall of silence. They weren't loud accusations. Not yet. The town wasn't ready for that. Instead, there were whispers. They were low, careful, and rhythmic. The kind of talk you only hear behind closed doors or in the front seats of idling cars. People started asking the questions they should have asked in April. What happened to Jack's face? Why didn't a single adult in that building say anything when they saw a toddler with a blackened eye? And most of all, the question that turned stomachs. Who was he with that weekend? The name that kept surfacing, bobbing to the top of every conversation like debris in a flood, was Daniel Martel. He was Jack's stepfather, the man who had stepped into the frame of their lives and claimed the role of protector. He was a man who said he loved them, provided for them, and kept them safe from the world. When the rumors finally reached him, Daniel didn't flinch. He shrugged it off with the practiced ease of a man used to explaining away complications. He said Jack was clumsy. He said the boy had simply bumped into something in the dark. Boys get active, he'd say. It wasn't serious. But that explanation was a one-sided story. It never came from Jack. No one else in the neighborhood remembered an accident. No one saw a fall. And then, as the questions grew sharper, the man grew quieter. Daniel Martel stopped showing up in public. He stopped answering the door. The image of the quiet, grieving stepfather started to fracture, revealing something much sharper and more jagged underneath. The silence wasn't just grief. It was a shield. And behind that shield, the truth was being buried deeper every hour. The bruise in the photo was the first time the world truly noticed, but it wasn't the beginning of the story. If you talk to the people who inhabited the margins of Jack and Lily's lives, you realize there were quiet warnings long before the camera shutter clicked. These were moments tucked away in the dusty corners of conversations, easily overlooked in the frantic busyness of daily life. We like to think that danger arrives with a scream, but in the case of the Sullivan children, it arrived in the form of a flinch. A teacher at the preschool remembered it clearly after the children were gone. She noticed how Jack would recoil if someone raised their voice, not even at him, just in his general direction. A neighbor recalled the sound of shouting through the thin walls of the duplex, a raw, Guttural noise that didn't sound like a typical family argument. But they dismissed it. People always dismiss it. They told themselves it was none of their business. Another child, during a playdate that should have been forgotten, mentioned that Daniel gets mad a lot. It was brushed off as a child's overactive imagination. Kids say things, after all. They exaggerate. They misunderstand the world of adults. But hindsight has a cruel, piercing clarity. When you take those isolated moments and line them up like the broken pieces of a shattered mirror, a pattern begins to emerge. It wasn't a loud pattern, but it was persistent. There was no official report filed with the authorities. There was no social services file opened, no intervention staged by concerned relatives. This didn't happen because no one cared. It happened because no one thought it was serious enough. Yet, they were waiting for a sign that couldn't be ignored. They were waiting for the bruise. And that is the inherent danger of subtle harm. It thrives on the hesitation of others. It relies on the politeness of neighbors and the exhaustion of teachers. The bruise in the school photo was a physical manifestation of a deeper rot. But the real damage had started months earlier. It was the fear Jack couldn't find the words to name. It was a tension that Malia, his mother, tried so desperately to explain away to her friends and family. It was the community's collective decision to look the other way until the children were no longer there to be looked at. Jack had been whispering in his own way for weeks. He was only 4 years old, too young to articulate the complexities of domestic fear, too young to use words like abuse or endangerment. But he was old enough to sense a predator in his own home. He wore that anxiety like a second skin. His teachers noticed a change in his soul before they noticed the marks on his body. He stopped running to the door when the bell rang. He stopped laughing at the jokes the other toddlers made. Sometimes, he would just sit at a small wooden table, tracing invisible patterns in the grain with a trembling finger. When the adults asked him why he was so quiet, he would just shrug his small shoulders. Then came the nervousness, a sanitized word we use when we are too afraid to say a child is terrified. If a man walked into the room too quickly, Jack would flinch. Once, he spilled a small cup of apple juice and burst into a fit of inconsolable tears before any adult had even reacted. The daycare workers chalked it up to a phase. They told themselves that toddlers go through moods, that development is a rocky road. It's normal, they said, until it wasn't. A neighbor remembered mourning just 2 weeks before the disappearance. She saw Jack clinging to his mother's leg in the driveway, refusing to let go, his face buried in her coat. The neighbor had joked that he was just being extra sensitive lately. She didn't know that she was watching a child try to anchor himself to the only safety he had left. We don't know exactly what Jack was trying to tell us in those final days, but we know this. Children do not change their entire personalities without a reason. In the puzzle of their disappearance, Jack's silence was the loudest clue of all, the one everyone heard but no one listened to. After Jack and Lily Sullivan vanished into the gray light of a May morning, the world expected a specific kind of sound. They expected a mother's scream, the kind of raw, guttural agony that pierces through a neighborhood and demands the universe return what was stolen. But Malia Sullivan gave them something else entirely. She gave them silence. It wasn't the composed, dignified silence of a woman holding herself together for the sake of an investigation. It wasn't the strategic, guarded silence of someone being coached by a high-priced legal team. No, this was a heavy, suffocating silence of someone who had been swallowed whole by something much darker than simple grief. In the harrowing days following May 2nd, Malia barely spoke a word to the outside world. There were no frantic press conferences held on the front lawn, no sobbing televised interviews pleading for the safe return of her babies. No emotional messages looked directly into the camera lens to reach whoever might be holding them. People noticed. In a culture that demands a public performance of tragedy, her stillness was seen as an anomaly. Some observers called it grief paralysis, a psychological freezing of the soul in the face of the unthinkable. Others, fueled by the anonymity of the internet, began to whisper darker, more cynical theories. But to understand Malia's silence after the disappearance, you have to look at the silence that began months before the children were gone. Her friends say she didn't just disappear on May 2nd. She had been fading for a long time. She had slowly withdrawn from the mom meetups at the local park. She turned off the red receipts on her text messages, leaving questions from her own mother hanging in the digital void for days. Most tellingly, she stopped posting photos of Jack and Lily online. Before Daniel Martell moved in, her social media feed was a vibrant, constant stream of her children's lives. First steps, messy faces, birthday candles. Then the screen went dark. It was as if she was trying to hide them from a world that had suddenly become too dangerous to invite in. One family member recalled that Malia became increasingly difficult to reach by phone. If you did manage to get her on the line, the conversation felt hollowed out, as if she were reading from a script. Another relative noted a chilling shift. It felt like Daniel was speaking for both of them. This is the insidious nature of domestic control. It often masquerades as care until you step back and realize you haven't made a choice of yourself in weeks. There were rumors that Daniel monitored her phone, that he discouraged visits from judgmental outsiders, and that he slowly pruned away her support system until he was the only person left in her garden. Perhaps the most haunting detail was Malia's use of language. In the few interactions she had with neighbors in those early weeks, she reportedly spoke of Jack and Lily in the past tense. They were such good kids, she would say, before catching herself and looking over her shoulder toward the house where Daniel sat behind drawn curtains. It was as if she had already mourned them long before the police arrived. Maybe that is why she has been so quiet. Silence isn't always a symptom of trauma. Sometimes, in a house governed by a volatile shadow, silence is the only safe thing you have left to do. It is a survival mechanism, a way to occupy as little space as possible so as not to draw the lightning. When the community held vigils, Malia stayed inside. When the volunteers organized search parties, she was nowhere to be seen. To the outside observer, it looked like indifference. To those who knew the history of the house on Gerlach Road, it looked like a woman who had already been broken into pieces. The silence of Malia Sullivan wasn't a lack of love. It was the sound of a woman who had lost her voice long before she lost her children. It was the sound of a house where the doors were locked from the inside, and the only person with the key wasn't the one who gave birth to the victims. Daniel Martell wasn't their biological father, but in the eyes of the law in the neighborhood, he was the only father figure they had. He moved into Jack and Lily's lives with quiet, almost surgical precision. There was no public fanfare, no celebratory wedding photos on the mantle, no grand introductions to the extended family. He was just there, a man with a heavy toolbox, a tired, lopsided smile, and a hard-earned reputation for minding his own business. In a small town like Waterton, being a man who kept himself was considered a virtue, not a red flag. He wasn't known to be violent. He wasn't known to be warm. He was simply a fixture of the household. The role of a stepfather is a delicate, often thankless tightrope walk. You are expected to protect, yet you are rarely fully trusted. You are part of the family, but often only in the fragments of daily chores and financial obligations. For a while, Daniel played the part with convincing mundanity. He handled the grocery runs, the school pickups, and the fixing of the kitchen faucet when it dripped too long into the night. But when the pressure of real life began to mount, the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The whispers around town began to paint a picture of a man spiraling. There were reports that he struggled to hold down consistent work, drifting from one construction site to another, never quite fitting in with the crews. Neighbors began to see him pacing the backyard odd hours of the night, sometimes shirtless, even in the bite of the late autumn chill, muttering to himself as he walked circles in the grass. One woman across the street remembered a night when Daniel yelled so loudly at something inside the house that she reflexively shut her windows and locked her doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. Financial strain doesn't always scream through credit reports. It seeps out through the cracks of a person's dignity. A bounce rent check in March. A quietly sold set of expensive power tools in April. A change in his beer brand from expensive bottles to the cheapest cans. And then, finally, to none at all. His social media footprint was a ghost. A single Facebook account with one outdated photo. No recent posts and no tags from friends. It was a digital dead end. One former co-worker claimed Daniel had been fired after a terrifying, unprovoked confrontation on a job site where he seemed to lose time. Another said he simply quit before payday twice in a row, leaving money on the table as if he were running from something he couldn't name. Then, There were the physical observations. Malia's cousin claimed she once saw Daniel with dilated pupils and a locked jaw, the classic thousand-yard stare of someone fueled by something chemical. But in Waterton, people are polite to a fault. No one followed up. No one asked the hard questions, because that's the thing about small towns. Secrets are often visible to everyone, but everyone is too afraid or too neighborly to say them out loud. So, who was the real Daniel Martel? Was he a man genuinely trying to build a life on the unstable ground of another man's family? Was he a father figure who simply buckled and shattered under the weight of mounting pressure? Or was he someone hiding much deeper, more dangerous fractures behind that careful, practiced stillness? As the days turned into weeks after the children vanished, that question stopped being about his character and started being about the truth. It became about what a man might do to protect a secret that was rotting him from the inside out. You can't smell a rumor and you can't prove a whisper, but where there is smoke, there is usually a fire that has been burning for a long time. The town eventually began to remember the odors, the sharp, chemical scent of burned plastic and vinegar that occasionally wafted from a Martel property. They remembered the strange visitors who didn't park in the street, but pulled around the back, hiding their cars behind the shed. They remembered Daniel's eyes, which one woman described as being awake in the wrong way. By the time the police finally started looking at the man with the toolbox, the tools were gone and the house was as silent as a grave. In the grim anatomy of every missing persons case, there is a specific, agonizing moment where time simply stops making sense. It is the void between the last seen and the first reported, a chronological black hole that swallows the truth. For Daniel Martel, that void is measured in the 3 hours and 12 minutes between 4 a.m. and 7:12 a.m. on the morning of May 2nd. These are the hours that define the disappearance of Jack and Lily Sullivan. The quiet, blue-gray hours of dawn before Malia finally placed a call to the police. According to Daniel's official statement, he was asleep through every second of it. But as the RCMP investigators would later note in their files, sleep is not a timeline. It is an excuse that conveniently lacks a memory of itself. Daniel claimed he had been home all night, cocooned in a heavy, undisturbed slumber. He swore he heard nothing, saw nothing, and knew absolutely nothing until Malia stumbled into the room, her voice a jagged whisper of they're gone. But the physical world outside that bedroom told a very different story. While Daniel claimed to be dreaming, the neighborhood was beginning to wake up, and eyes were watching the Martel driveway. One neighbor, an early riser who lived 3 houses down, distinctly recalled seeing movement in the backyard around 5:20 a.m., a dark shape shifting near the tree line that didn't quite match the gait of a stray animal. Another witness was more specific. They claimed Daniel's truck was absent from its usual spot at dawn, only to reappear by 7 a.m., the engine likely still pinging as it cooled. Then came the most chilling lead of all. A convenience store clerk on the edge of town, who swore a man matching Daniel's build walked into the shop just as the sun was cresting the horizon. He was sweaty, his eyes were darting wildly, and most notably, he was barefoot. He didn't buy water, food, or gas. He bought a single lighter and left without saying a word. Despite these sightings, no security footage ever surfaced to confirm the clerk's story, and no receipt was ever recovered. When the RCMP pushed Daniel to recount the granular details of his mourning, his narrative began to fragment like dry bone. In the first interview, he said he went to bed at midnight. In the second, he claimed he had actually nodded off on the couch and stayed there until dawn. He initially stated the back door was always double-locked, but under further questioning, he admitted the sliding door sometimes stuck open unless it was slammed with significant force. These are not necessarily lies, but in a capital case investigation, every contradiction becomes a crack. And eventually, those cracks begin to reveal what has been buried beneath them. The questions began to pile up like unread mail. Did Daniel leave the house that morning? If he did, where was he going barefoot at 5 in the morning? Why didn't he hear the heavy sliding door open if the house was as quiet as he claimed? Investigators found it haunting that while the children were gone, their boots were still by the door, yet a specific heavy blanket from the sofa had vanished along with them. The house remained undisturbed, with no signs of a struggle and no forced entry, suggesting that whoever took Jack and Lily didn't have to break in. They were already part of the architecture. As the authorities pushed for deeper access, Daniel didn't lean into the investigation. He pulled further away. His phone data was labeled inconclusive by technicians, and for reasons that still haunt the local community, his clothing from that morning was never seized for forensic testing. No search warrant was ever issued for the truck that neighbors saw come and go. The missing hours remain just that, missing. They exist as a hollow space in the truth, a window of time where the world changed forever for two small children. And the only adult who could have stopped it claims he was simply closed-eyed and dreaming. When children go missing, a community usually undergoes a radical transformation. The town of Waterton was no different. Flyers were stapled to every telephone pole until the ink ran from the rain. Boots hit the ground in organized grids. Strangers became searchers overnight. Time becomes the ultimate enemy in these moments, and the collective energy of the town was focused on a single, desperate goal. But in the hours, days, and weeks after Jack and Lily vanished, there was a glaring, jagged hole in the center of that effort. Daniel Martel was almost nowhere to be found. He didn't show up to the first community-led search. He wasn't seen handing out flyers at the local gas stations. He never took the microphone at a press conference to beg for the return of his stepchildren. He didn't walk with the volunteers through the tall, damp grass of the fields behind Gerlach Road. And he was noticeably absent when a search dog alerted near the creek, where Lily's pink blanket was eventually found caught in the brush. Instead, he stayed inside. He retreated into the shadows of a house that was now far too quiet. A father, even a stepfather, is expected to scream their names until his throat is raw. He is expected to demand answers from the police, to break down in front of the cameras, to be the loudest voice in the room. But Daniel chose the opposite path. That silence wasn't just noticed. It was burned into the memory of the town. People began to ask the hardest question of all. Was he grieving in private, or was he avoiding the public eye because he couldn't play the part? He later claimed he was supporting Malia, but grief doesn't always need structure. Sometimes it needs witnesses. Daniel refused to be seen. By the second month of the investigation, the silence turned into a visible surrender. Daniel Martel wasn't just quiet anymore. He was disappearing from himself. The lawn grew long and shaggy. The trash piled up on the porch. The curtains remained drawn tight against the afternoon sun. The same man who once paced the yard smoking now hid behind the glass. Then came the whispers that could no longer be ignored. Reports of Daniel being seen at a known drug house on the outskirts of town, a place the RCMP had surveilled for meth activity in the past. That glazed, wide-eyed look people had noticed wasn't grief, they said. It was an escape. The unraveling became public in small, tragic bursts. A delivery driver posted online about dropping a package at the house and hearing furniture being smashed inside, followed by a man's voice shouting at nothing. A toddler's toy, a plastic truck with Lily scrolled on the side in purple marker, had rolled out onto the porch. No one came to pick it up. It sat there in the rain for 3 days, a plastic tombstone for a childhood interrupted. Weeks later, Daniel was spotted stumbling into a ditch outside town at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. No charges were laid, but the image was set, a man falling apart piece by piece, refusing to look anyone in the eye. Now, months after the disappearance, we are forced back to the beginning, back to that school photograph. A pediatric trauma expert, after reviewing the sharpened image of Jack's black eye, concluded that the discoloration was consistent with blunt force trauma, the kind that requires intent and force. If that bruise wasn't an accident, then the entire disappearance is no longer a mystery. It is a cover-up. It is the final act of an eraser. The story of Jack and Lily Sullivan is no longer a collection of theories or TikTok deep dives. It is a reckoning for a town that saw the signs and chose to believe the clumsy excuse. Daniel Martel still walks free, protected by a lack of physical evidence and a wall of his own making. But as the walls of that house on Gerlach Road grow quieter, the silence inside has begun to sound like a confession. We are left with 2 children frozen in time, and a haunting question that echoes in every grocery line and on every street corner in Waterton. Did we miss the signs, or did we just wait until it's too late to care? Until the truth is told, Jack and Lily remain exactly where they've been since May 2nd, missing, but refusing to be forgotten.